Let's make sure that we all understand what is happening in Mark's gospel. The scene up to this point. Imagine you are one of the 12 disciples following Jesus. You follow him because he speaks with great authority and wisdom. He understands people, and he seems to know you from the first time you meet. And soon you are seeing miracles, lives are being changed, people who have been blind their entire lives are made to see, the deaf can hear. You see a dead girl raised to life. One night you even see him walking on the water through a storm. He isn't just performing miracles, though. He's feeding thousands in the wilderness. And you know that he did this miracle because you walked with him into this place in the wilderness, and you saw he brought nothing with him. You've come to love and respect him. And now imagine he tells you he'll be betrayed, killed, and then rise again. You'll probably assume he's speaking in parables. Messiahs don't die. You'll consider all the healings and the signs you've seen. And while you're considering all this, you'll have the chance to go on a long walking trip with him and the other disciples, and you will have a chance to speak to the other disciples alone. What do you say? Well, I would think they would ask, what did Jesus mean? What did he mean he'd be betrayed and killed? Surely he didn't mean one of us would betray him. Something like that. But no, they speak about none of these things. Instead, they argue about which of them is the best. So I think we all understand the setting. And all of this leads me to one question. What is wrong with men? Why are we so competitive? Somebody gave an amen to that. I know how silly this thought is. I was thinking about it in the car the other day, and I've realized I'm completely unqualified to provide the answer. I was thinking about how ridiculous this setting is, and I noticed a man in the car next to me look at me, and then when the light changed, he kind of hit the gas fast, and I hit the gas as well. When I was thinking about how ridiculous this was. See, and I, of course, know the problem is not just a problem with men, and it's not really about competition. It's about arrogance, conceit, self-importance, and pride. You see, we have a problem in our culture of living by comparison. We believe our self-worth is tied to how we compare with others. And this is how companies market to us. This is how social media companies generate buzz and interest. We do this because we're afraid. We have a fear of not measuring up, of being irrelevant, of being forgotten and alone. Comparison robs us of joy. It leaves us constantly discontent, and the disciples are caught in this trap. At this point in Mark, Jesus has told the disciples more than once that he will suffer and die, but they do not seem to be able to hear him. And at this point in Mark's gospel, the disciples and Jesus' inner circle believe they are royal officials in waiting. Jesus is the Messiah, and when he ascends to the throne, they'll become his court officials. And in an effort to make them realize how much they are missing the point, he sits them down and he brings a child in among them, and he says, "Whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me." And it would be difficult for us to understand how shocking this was to their ears. A rabbi who is seated and teaching his disciples does not bring in a child. We have an exalted view of children and childhood in our culture. We have a lofty view of their innocence and their view of the world. And it's true that in Mark's gospel, in another gospel, Jesus tells us to be like children, but that's not what's happening here in Mark. Jesus brings a child in among them because in the ancient world, even among the Jewish people, a child has low to no value. A child has less value than a household servant. A child in antiquity is a non-person. And this was partly by necessity. The infant mortality rate in ancient Rome was 30%, and 50% of the population died before their 15th birthday. For Jesus to suggest there would be any value in receiving a child as one who would receive the Messiah is inconceivable. Children have no honor, no status, and no prestige. Jesus is saying, far from being royal officials in waiting, the prestige you'll receive from being my disciple is equal to the prestige you would receive from welcoming a child. I think this is one of the most important lessons we learn from Jesus. Almost from birth, we are taught through the media that our self-worth is tied to how we compare with others. We're consumers, and the basis of our consumerism depends on that we want to have what other people have, we want to do what other people are doing, we want to look as happy as those people look in those advertisements. And Jesus tells us this morning that our spiritual maturity, our depth of faith, our love of God is demonstrated by how we treat the people in our society who have the least prestige and status. In Jesus' time, that person was a child. In our time, I'm not sure what that person would be. Maybe the poor, maybe the homeless, maybe the addict, maybe the mentally ill. So the question is simple. Do you treat those people with dignity and respect? Not because they've earned it, because a child in Jesus' time could not have earned it. Not because they deserve it, because of their work ethic or their accomplishments, because a child in Jesus' time could not deserve it. We simply treat the last, the lost, and the least with dignity and respect because they are made in the image of God. Another way of asking the question would be, when you serve the window at the sack lunch window, or when you serve the people at breakfast on Broadway, or you run into people at the store and in the street, how do you treat them? I love the Episcopal Church and the Anglican communion. I love the liturgy and how it's rooted in community and not radical individualism. I love the tradition that grounds us. I love how we're not afraid to ask hard questions and we have a progressive outreach to our community. I love the shared practice and prayer that unites us rather than common understanding of belief. I love how there's a process of discernment, of background checks and psych evaluations before people can go to seminary and be ordained. But we could do all of those things perfectly. And if we don't get this right, God is not pleased. And we could do all of those things terribly, but if we got this one thing right, God would be pleased. Here's the big point. Living by comparison is a predisposition in our culture that damages our relationship with God more than anything else. And we know this because over and over again, Jesus teaches this. He said, love your neighbor as yourself. He said, God will only forgive you to the extent you're willing to forgive your neighbor. He said the greatest commandment is love God and love your neighbor. If we believe our value and self-worth is dependent on how we measure up to others, we'll never be able to treat people we don't care if we compare to with dignity and respect, because Jesus tells us we cannot love anyone more than we love ourselves. Your value and worth as a person depend on one thing. You are made in the image of God. And there is no one on earth, no one in history, who can be better at being you than you can. And if you understand this, you'll free yourself from the trap of worry, of the things, if your stuff isn't as nice as your neighbor's. You'll find that you're content with what you have. You'll find that you are free from fear, envy, and jealousy. Imagine the contentment and joy you'll find if you suddenly become aware to God's image living on you and you see yourself as God sees you. Whoever wants to be first must be last and servant of all. And anyone who welcomes those who are low in prestige, like this child, also welcome me. And now there are probably some men here today who are thinking, I'm going to go out and I'm going to welcome somebody way lower than that other guy. I know that's the case. Because when I was writing this sermon, I thought, I need to do a better job. I'm going to do a better job of this then. And the problem is noticing that they're way low. That's the problem. When Jesus asked the disciples what they had been arguing about, they felt shame because they knew their words and their thoughts and their hearts were wrong because they were in the presence of Emmanuel, God with us. And that is the comparison that matters. And somehow when we make that comparison to the holiness of God and Jesus Christ, we don't think less of ourselves, but for some reason we see ourselves through God's eyes. And those are the eyes of love. So what would happen if we saw everyone around us as someone made in the image of God? What if we saw the homeless, the addict, children, adulterers, Democrats and Republicans, the mentally ill? What would happen if we saw the people that we think less of as people made in God's image? What would happen if we remembered that they too are created in God's image and indwelt perhaps by God's Spirit? And what would happen if we found ourselves humbled before the image of God in them and in us?